The deadbolt clicked, the wood groaned, and for the first time in my life, I realized that a locked door is only a suggestion to a thing that doesn't breathe. The winter of 2021 was not just cold, it was predatory. I lived alone in a drafty two-story craftsman-style house on the outskirts of a small town in the Pacific Northwest. The nearest neighbor was a good quarter-mile down a winding, unlit road that was currently being swallowed by a relentless blizzard. By 6:00 p.m., the world outside my window had vanished, replaced by a swirling, violent wall of white. The local news had issued a code red weather alert, advising everyone to stay indoors and stock up on supplies. I was lucky. I had enough firewood to last a week and a pantry full of canned goods. Being off work was a rare luxury, and I intended to spend the evening in complete isolation. There is a certain kind of peace that comes with being trapped by nature. The responsibility to be anywhere or do anything simply evaporates. I spent the afternoon reading by the fireplace, watching the embers glow as the wind howled like a wounded animal against the siding of the house. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. Even with the central heating humming and the fireplace crackling, I could feel the icy fingers of the storm reaching through the cracks in the window frames. By 9:00 p.m., I moved from my armchair to the large sectional sofa in the living room. I turned on the television for some background noise, but the satellite signal was long gone, flickering with digital artifacts before finally settling into a rhythmic static hiss. The sound was strangely hypnotic. Wrapped in 3 layers of heavy wool blankets, I watched the rhythmic swaying of the pine trees through the frosted glass of the patio doors. Eventually, the exhaustion of the cold and the comfort of the blankets pulled me into a deep, dreamless sleep. I don't know exactly how long I was out, but the transition from sleep to wakefulness wasn't gradual. I jolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. The house was silent, save for the muffled roar of the wind, yet every nerve in my body was screaming that something was wrong. I sat perfectly still, straining my ears. Thump, thump, thump. It was a rhythmic, heavy sound. It wasn't the sharp rap of a knuckle on wood. It was softer, like something heavy and padded was hitting the front door. I looked at the digital clock on the microwave in the kitchen, 1:14 a.m. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the large room. No response. I waited for several minutes, thinking it might have been a heavy branch falling or the house settling under the weight of the 3 feet of snow now resting on the roof. I tried to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy, and decided to head upstairs to my bedroom where I felt more secure. But as I walked past the foyer, a cold draft hit my ankles. I stopped in front of the heavy oak front door. My instinct told me to just keep walking, to go upstairs and lock my bedroom door, but curiosity is a dangerous thing. I leaned forward and looked through the peephole. It was useless. The glass was caked in a thick layer of crystalline frost and wind-driven snow. It was like looking into a bucket of milk. Taking a deep breath, I slowly turned the deadbolt. The metal was freezing to the touch. I cracked the door open just an inch, expecting to feel the full force of the gale. Instead, the wind had momentarily died down to a ghostly whistle. I pushed the door wider. The porch light was flickering, struggling against the cold. The porch was covered in a thick carpet of white, but it wasn't pristine. There was a deep, jagged furrow in the snow, starting from the edge of the steps and leading directly to my door. It wasn't a set of footprints. There were no distinct shapes of boots or shoes. It looked as if someone had been dragging their lower body, or perhaps walking with heavy, uncoordinated steps that plowed through the drifts rather than stepping over them. The trail led right up to the threshold where I stood, and then it seemed to loop back toward the darkness of the driveway. I stepped out onto the porch, the sub-zero air burning my lungs. "Hello," I shouted into the white abyss. The visibility was less than 5 feet. The world beyond my porch was a chaotic void of swirling flakes. I couldn't see my car, which was parked only 10 feet away. I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Somewhere out there, just beyond the reach of the flickering porch light, someone or something was standing in the dark, perfectly still, watching me. A shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. I backed into the house and slammed the door, locking both the deadbolt and the chain. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely grip the handle. I decided I wasn't going to sleep. I went to the kitchen to make some coffee, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe a hiker got lost, maybe someone's car broke down, but why wouldn't they shout for help? Why would they just hit the door and then retreat into a lethal storm? As I waited for the water to boil, I noticed the temperature in the kitchen had dropped significantly. I looked up at the vent. No air was coming out. I walked over to the hallway where the thermostat was located. The digital display was dark. I pressed the buttons, but nothing happened. Great asterisk, I thought the furnace must have blown a fuse. But then I looked closer. The physical switch on the side of the thermostat, the one that required a firm manual click to move, was set to off. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I hadn't touched that switch in months. I lived alone. There was no way that switch could move on its own. I slowly turned around, looking toward the living room. The TV was still on, but the static had changed. The white noise was gone. In its place was a low, guttural humming sound coming from the speakers. I walked back toward the living room, my footsteps silent on the rug. As I rounded the corner, I stopped dead. The silhouette of the high-backed armchair, which was positioned facing away from me toward the fireplace, was occupied. I could see the top of a head, thin, matted hair, damp with melted snow. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "How did you get in here?" The figure didn't move. They didn't even seem to be breathing. Then very slowly the chair began to creak. The person wasn't getting up. They were simply turning their head. They turned it further than a human neck should comfortably allow, until I could see the profile of a face that looked as pale as the snow outside. One wide, unblinking eye fixed onto mine, and a slow, distorted grin began to spread across their face. "I was waiting for you to wake up." A voice rasped, a voice that sounded like wet gravel grinding together. The air in the living room felt like it had turned to liquid nitrogen. I stood at the edge of the hallway, my hand gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles were white. The man sitting in my armchair didn't move an inch. From the back, he looked like a heap of wet, dark rags, but the way his head was craned at a sharp, unnatural angle toward me made my stomach churn. How did you get in here?" I managed to stammer. My voice sounded small against the roar of the wind outside. The intruder didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like sandpaper rubbing together. A thick cloud of vapor escaped his blue-tinted lips. He was shivering, but not like a normal shivering person. His movements were jerky, mechanical, as if his muscles were freezing solid while he sat there. "So warm," he whispered. The voice wasn't human. It was a guttural, raspy wetness, like someone trying to speak with a throat full of slush. I took a step back, my eyes darting around for a weapon. My mind raced through the house's layout. Had I left the basement window unlatched? Was the sliding door in the back truly locked? It didn't matter now. He was inside. "I have a gun," I lied, my voice trembling. "You need to leave right now. I've already called the police." At the mention of the police, the man's grin widened. He began to stand up. It wasn't a smooth motion. His joints popped and cracked with a sickening sound that echoed in the quiet room. As he rose, I realized how tall he was, lanky, skeletal, and dressed in clothes that were soaked through and caked with ice. He turned his full body toward me, and I saw his eyes. They weren't just bloodshot. They were wide, fixed, and completely devoid of any rational thought. "The phones are dead," he wheezed. "The wires, they snapped under the ice just like birds." He took a step toward me. His feet were bare, his toes a horrific shade of purple-black from frostbite. He didn't seem to feel the pain. He was leaving wet, slushy prints on my hardwood floor, each step accompanied by a heavy asterisk, thud squelch asterisk. I didn't wait for a second longer. I turned and bolted toward the kitchen, my socks sliding on the floor. I needed to reach the knife block. I could hear him behind me, not running, but moving with a terrifying, rhythmic pace. Step, drag, step, drag. I reached the kitchen island and grabbed the largest chef's knife I had. I spun around, holding it out with both hands. "Stay back, I'm warning you." He stopped at the entrance of the kitchen, bathed in the flickering light of the microwave clock. He tilted his head to the side, looking at the knife as if it were a curious toy. Then his gaze shifted to the kitchen window. "You think walls keep the cold out?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "The cold always finds a way in, it's patient." Suddenly, the power flickered. The lights buzzed, turned a dull orange, and then died completely. The house was plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness, illuminated only by the ghostly white reflection of the snow from the broken window. In that darkness, I heard the sound of him lunging, not toward me, but toward the back door. I heard the heavy thud of his body hitting the wood, followed by the sound of the deadbolt being thrown. He wasn't trying to leave, he was locking us both in. The air in the living room felt like it had turned to liquid nitrogen. I stood at the edge of the hallway, my hand gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles were white. The man sitting in my armchair didn't move an inch. From the back, he looked like a heap of wet, dark rags, but the way his head was craned at a sharp, unnatural angle toward me made my stomach churn. How did you get in here?" I managed to stammer. My voice sounded small against the roar of the wind outside. The intruder didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like sandpaper rubbing together. A thick cloud of vapor escaped his blue-tinted lips. He was shivering, but not like a normal shivering person. His movements were jerky, mechanical, as if his muscles were freezing solid while he sat there. "So warm," he whispered. The voice wasn't human. It was a guttural, raspy wetness, like someone trying to speak with a throat full of slush. I took a step back, my eyes darting around for a weapon. My mind raced through the house's layout. Had I left the basement window unlatched? Was the sliding door in the back truly locked? It didn't matter now. He was inside. "I have a gun," I lied, my voice trembling. "You need to leave right now. I've already called the police." At the mention of the police, the man's grin widened. He began to stand up. It wasn't a smooth motion. His joints popped and cracked with a sickening sound that echoed in the quiet room. As he rose, I realized how tall he was, lanky, skeletal, and dressed in clothes that were soaked through and caked with ice. He turned his full body toward me, and I saw his eyes. They weren't just bloodshot. They were wide, fixed, and completely devoid of any rational thought. "The phones are dead," he wheezed. "The wires, they snapped under the ice just like birds." He took a step toward me. His feet were bare, his toes a horrific shade of purple-black from frostbite. He didn't seem to feel the pain. He was leaving wet, slushy prints on my hardwood floor, each step accompanied by a heavy asterisk thud squelch asterisk. I didn't wait for a second longer. I turned and bolted toward the kitchen, my socks sliding on the floor. I needed to reach the knife block. I could hear him behind me, not running, but moving with a terrifying, rhythmic pace. Step, drag, step, drag. I reached the kitchen island and grabbed the largest chef's knife I had. I spun around, holding it out with both hands. "Stay back, I'm warning you." He stopped at the entrance of the kitchen, bathed in the flickering light of the microwave clock. He tilted his head to the side, looking at the knife as if it were a curious toy. Then his gaze shifted to the kitchen window. "You think walls keep the cold out?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "The cold always finds a way in, it's patient." Suddenly, the power flickered. The lights buzzed, turned a dull orange, and then died completely. The house was plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness, illuminated only by the ghostly white reflection of the snow from the broken window. In that darkness, I heard the sound of him lunging, not toward me, but toward the back door. I heard the heavy thud of his body hitting the wood, followed by the sound of the deadbolt being thrown. He wasn't trying to leave, he was locking us both in. The darkness that swallowed the kitchen was absolute. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning from the winter storm, casting jagged, blue-white shadows across the room. I stood frozen, the heavy chef's knife trembling in my hand. I could hear his breathing, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from every corner of the room at once. Thump. The sound of the deadbolt clicking into place on the back door echoed like a gunshot. He had moved with a speed that defied his frozen, skeletal appearance. He wasn't just a drifter looking for warmth, he was a predator ensuring his prey had no exit. "Why are you doing this?" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Take whatever you want, I have money in the living room, electronics, just take it and leave." A low, gurgling laugh responded from the shadows near the pantry. "Money is paper," the voice rasped. "Paper burns, but only for a second. I need the heat that stays, the heat in the marrow." I felt a surge of pure, primal adrenaline. I backed away from the voice, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I made a break for the hallway, hopping to reach the stairs. If I could get to the second floor and lock myself in the bathroom, I might be able to climb out of the window onto the porch roof. As I ran through the dark, I felt something cold brush against my shoulder. It wasn't just the cold of the air, it was a physical touch, like a bag of ice water hitting my skin. I swung the knife wildly behind me, feeling the blade bite into something dense and resistant. There was no cry of pain, only the sound of fabric tearing and a dull asterisk thunk as if I had hit a frozen piece of wood. I didn't stop to look. I scrambled up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it would burst. I reached the landing and lunged for my bedroom door, slamming it shut and shoving the heavy dresser in front of it. I slumped against the dresser, gasping for air. The room was freezing. I looked at the window expecting to see the blizzard, but the glass was covered in a thick, unnatural layer of frost on the asterisk inside asterisk. Then I heard it, a soft rhythmic scratching. It wasn't coming from the door, it was coming from the floorboards beneath my feet. I looked down. Through the narrow gaps in the old wood, I saw a pale, frost-bitten finger poking through, wiggling like a worm. Then another. He wasn't trying to come through the door, he was in the crawl space between the floors, ripping through the lath and plaster with his bare, frozen hands. "I can feel you, pulsing," the voice whispered from directly beneath me, like a furnace so bright. I jumped onto my bed away from the spot on the floor. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. The wood began to splinter. I realized then that the house was no longer my sanctuary, it was his hunting ground. He knew every crack, every vent, and every weak point in the structure. I looked toward the master bathroom. There was a small skylight there. It was a long shot, but it was my only chance. I grabbed my heavy winter coat from the chair, shoved the knife into my pocket, and bolted for the bathroom. Just as I slammed the bathroom door, I heard the bedroom floorboards give way with a deafening crack. A gust of sub-zero air followed me into the small room, smelling of old ice and decay. I looked up at the skylight. It was crusted over with snow, but if I could break it, I could crawl onto the roof. I climbed onto the vanity, using the towel rack as a step. My hands were shaking so much I could barely grip the latch. Suddenly, the mirror in front of me began to fog up, but the fog wasn't coming from my breath. It was forming from the bottom up, and in the condensation, a word began to appear, traced by an invisible, frozen finger. *OPEN. The air in the bathroom dropped so sharply that the water in the toilet bowl cracked as it froze. I looked toward the door. The handle began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Creak and creak and creak. The wood around the hinges started to frost over. He wasn't just turning the handle, he was freezing the metal until it became brittle enough to shatter. The bathroom was no longer a room, it was a meat locker. My breath came out in thick, ragged clouds that felt like they were freezing the moment they left my lungs. The bathroom door groaned, the wood fibers snapping as the intruder applied pressure. The frost creeping from the hinges was thick now, turning the metal brittle. I turned my back to the door and focused on the skylight. It was my only exit. I grabbed a heavy glass candle holder from the vanity and smashed it against the skylight's pane. The sound was deafening in the small space, but the glass didn't shatter, it was reinforced. I struck it again, and this time a web of cracks blossomed across the surface. Crack! The bathroom door handle didn't just turn, it shattered into 100 metallic pieces. The door swung open, hitting the wall with a dull thud. He was there. He stood in the doorway, his frame casting a long, jagged shadow. He looked even worse than before. His skin had taken on a translucent, waxy sheen, and I could see the dark, frozen blood stilled in his veins. He didn't rush in, he stood there, tilted his head, and watched me with that horrific, wide-eyed stare. "The warmth is fading," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering across ice. "You're getting cold, let me help." I screamed and threw the candle holder at his face. It struck his forehead, but there was no blood, no flinch. It was like hitting a statue. He took a step into the bathroom, and the floor tiles beneath his bare, black feet cracked from the sudden drop in temperature. Desperation took over. I turned back to the skylight and threw my entire body weight into it, shoulder first. The cracked glass finally gave way. I felt the jagged edges slice through my heavy coat and into my shoulder, but I didn't care. I scrambled upward, pulling myself through the narrow opening and onto the roof. The blizzard hit me like a physical blow. The wind was so strong I couldn't stand. I had to crawl on my stomach across the shingles, which were slick with a layer of treacherous ice. Below me, the world was a white abyss. I couldn't see the ground, only the tops of the pine trees swaying violently in the gale. I looked back at the skylight. A pale, skeletal hand reached through the broken glass, grasping at the air. Then his head emerged. He climbed out with the agility of a spider, his movements jerky and disjointed. He didn't seem to feel the wind or the shards of glass cutting into his limbs. He was coming for me on the roof. I slid toward the edge, aiming for the spot where I knew the porch roof sat a few feet below. I let myself drop, falling into a massive drift of snow that had piled up on the lower roof. It cushioned my fall, but I was buried for a few seconds, struggling to find air in the freezing powder. As I surfaced, I looked up. He was standing on the peak of the main roof, silhouetted against the dark, stormy sky. He looked down at me, and for the first time, he didn't smile. His face twisted into a mask of pure, hunger-driven rage. He didn't climb down, he leapt. I rolled out of the way just as he slammed into the porch roof where I had been lying. The wood groaned under the impact. I didn't wait to see if he was hurt. I scrambled to the edge of the porch roof and jumped blindly into the darkness, praying the snow on the ground was deep enough to save me. I hit the ground hard, the snow reaching my chest. My car was only 20 feet away, but in this storm it felt like a mile. I could hear him behind me, the sound of his body hitting the snow with a heavy, wet thud. "Run, little furnace," I heard his voice carried by the wind. "Run until you go out." I struggled through the waist-deep drifts toward the garage, my lungs burning, my vision blurring. I reached the side door of the garage, fumbling for the key I always kept hidden under a loose brick. My fingers were so numb I could barely feel the cold metal. Finally, I found it. I jammed the key into the lock, turned it, and dived inside just as a cold, dead hand brushed against the heel of my boot. I slammed the side door of the garage and leaned my back against it, sliding down until I hit the cold concrete floor. My lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass, each breath a stinging reminder of the sub-zero air I had just escaped. I stayed there for a moment, listening. Outside, the wind screamed, but closer, just on the other side of the thin wooden door, I heard a soft, wet sliding sound. SSSSHHHHK. SSSSHHHK. It was the sound of frozen fabric brushing against the exterior siding. He was circling the garage, looking for a gap, a vent, or a weak board. I stood up shakily. The garage was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of the snow pressing against the high, rectangular windows. I reached for the light switch, but remembered the power was out. I needed a light source. I fumbled along the workbench, my frozen fingers knocking over jars of screws and old paint cans until I found my heavy-duty mag light. I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, reflecting off the polished hood of my car. The garage felt like a tomb. I walked over to the main bay door, the large rolling door that led to the driveway. I grabbed the handle and pulled upward with everything I had. It didn't move. The snow outside had drifted so high that the door was effectively barricaded from the outside. I was trapped in a box of concrete and steel, and I wasn't alone. A sudden asterisk thump came from the roof of the garage, then another. He was up there. I tracked the sound with my flashlight, the beam dancing across the exposed wooden rafters of the ceiling. I saw the attic hatch, the small wooden square I had used for storage. It began to vibrate. "You're burning out," the voice drifted down through the cracks in the wood. "I can hear your heart slowing down. It wants to be still." I didn't answer. I grabbed a gallon jug of motor oil from the shelf and unscrewed the cap. I began pouring it in a thick, slick circle around the area beneath the hatch. If he dropped down, he wouldn't find his footing. Then I grabbed a long crowbar from my tool chest. It was heavy, solid, and cold, a much better weapon than the kitchen knife. The hatch cover was suddenly ripped upward, disappearing into the dark void of the crawlspace. Two gray, frost-bitten legs dangled down, swinging back and forth like a pendulum. He dropped. He hit the oiled concrete, and his feet slid out from under him immediately. He hit the floor with a sound like a bag of wet gravel. I didn't hesitate. I lunged forward and swung the crowbar with a primal roar. The iron bar caught him across the ribs. I felt things snap, not like bone, but like frozen plastic. He didn't gasp. He didn't groan. He simply rolled over, his movements fluid and oily, and grabbed the end of the crowbar with a hand that felt like a meat hook. He pulled. I was jerked off my feet, sliding across the oily floor toward him. Up close, the smell was unbearable. It was the scent of a walk-in freezer that had been unplugged for a month. His eyes were milky, the pupils blown wide, reflecting my own terrified face in the flashlight's beam. "Gives it to me," he hissed, his mouth opening wider than humanly possible. I let go of the crowbar and kicked him square in the chest, using the slick oil to propel myself backward. I scrambled toward the car, dived into the driver's seat, and slammed the lock button. I sat there, gasping, staring through the windshield. He rose slowly from the oil-slicked floor, the crowbar still clutched in his hand. He walked toward the car, his reflection ghosting across the glass. He didn't try to break the window. Instead, he leaned his face against the driver's side glass, his skin sticking to the cold surface. He began to hum, a low, vibrating tune that I recognized from my childhood, a Christmas carol, distorted and slowed down until it sounded like a funeral dirge. Then he raised the crowbar. I sat in the driver's seat, my breath hitching as I watched him through the glass. The car felt like a tiny island of safety, but I knew better. The interior was already freezing, the leather seats stiff and biting through my clothes. Outside, the intruder's face remained pressed against my window, his skin leaving a translucent, frosted smear on the glass. The humming continued, a low, distorted vibration that I could feel in the steering wheel. Then, he slowly raised the crowbar. "Greg." He didn't swing it like a baseball bat. He pressed the tip of the iron bar against the top corner of the window and leaned his weight into it. The safety glass groaned, 1,000 tiny spiderwebs blooming from the point of impact. I scrambled into the passenger seat, kicking the door, but it was locked from the outside by the snow drifts. "Why?" I screamed, the sound muffled by the car's insulation. "What do you want from me?" The man stopped leaning. He pulled the crowbar back just an inch and tapped the glass gently right where my face had been. Tap, tap, tap. "I want to feel the spark," he wheezed. His voice was clearer now, as if the proximity to the car's lingering engine heat was reviving his vocal cords. "The heat behind the eyes, give it to me." He swung the bar with a sudden, violent jerk. The side window shattered, exploding into thousands of harmless glass cubes, but the cold that rushed in was far from harmless. It was a physical force, a tidal wave of sub-zero air that stripped the remaining warmth from my body in seconds. A blue, shriveled hand reached through the broken window, fumbling for the door lock. I lunged forward, grabbing a heavy metal flashlight from the center console and smashed it down on his fingers. It was like hitting a bundle of frozen twigs. I heard the snap of bone, but the hand didn't retract. It didn't even flinch. Those broken fingers continued to claw at the plastic lock until *click*, the door swung open. I threw myself into the back seat, kicking out with both feet. "Get out, get away from me." He crawled into the driver's seat, his movements slow and agonizingly deliberate. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew I had nowhere to go. The garage was sealed, the car was dead, and the storm outside was a death sentence. "Your blood, it's so loud," he whispered, turning his head to look at me over the headrest. His eyes were now leaking a dark, thick fluid that froze into black icicles on his cheeks, like a boiling kettle. I reached for the door handle on the other side, but it was jammed against a stack of winter tires I had stored in the corner of the garage. I was pinned. My hands searched the floor mats, desperately looking for anything, and my fingers brushed against something cold and plastic. The emergency kit. I ripped it open. Inside were flares, a first aid kit, and a small, handheld canister of de-icer spray. My mind clicked into gear. I grabbed the de-icer and a small disposable lighter I kept in the glove box for emergencies. He lunged over the seat, his frozen fingers reaching for my throat. I could feel the necrotic chill of his breath on my skin. "Stay warm," I hissed. I clicked the lighter and sprayed a long, pressurized stream of the alcohol-based de-icer through the flame. A jet of orange fire erupted, a makeshift flamethrower that cut through the darkness of the car. The fire hit him full in the face. For the first time, he screamed. It wasn't a human scream, it was the sound of a steam whistle, a high-pitched, screeching hiss as the ice on his skin turned instantly to vapor. The smell was appalling, the scent of burning hair and ancient, thawing meat. He recoiled, tumbling back into the front seat, his face a blackened, steaming ruin. I didn't wait. I used the distraction to throw my weight against the passenger door, shoving it hard against the tires until there was just enough space to squeeze through. I tumbled out of the car and onto the oily concrete, the fire from the de-icer still flickering in the air. But the fire was dying. The canister was almost empty. And in the corner of the garage beneath the swinging attic hatch, I saw him beginning to stand up again. The fire hadn't killed him, it had only made him hungrier. The garage was silent for a heartbeat, the only sound being the hiss of the dying flame from my makeshift torch. The smell of scorched, ancient flesh hung heavy in the air. I stood pressed against the cold cinderblock wall, clutching the empty de-icer canister like a shield. My eyes were locked on the car, waiting for the shadow to move. Then I heard it, a wet peeling sound. The intruder crawled out of the driver's side door. The fire had melted the frost on his face, revealing raw, gray muscle and blackened skin that didn't bleed. He looked less like a man now and more like a thawed corpse. He wiped the soot from his eyes with a charred hand, his movements faster now, fueled by a frantic, desperate rage. "It hurts," he gurgled. The voice was no longer a whisper, it was a jagged screech. "The heat, it burns, I need to put it out." He lunged. He didn't stumble on the oil this time. He moved with a terrifying, spider-like agility, his fingers digging into the concrete floor. I swung the heavy maglite at his head as he closed the distance. The metal casing connected with his temple with a sickening asterisk crack, but he didn't stop. He tackled me, his weight cold and heavy as a slab of granite. We crashed into a stack of metal shelving. Tools, cans of paint, and heavy chains rained down on us. I felt a sharp pain in my side as a shelf corner dug into my ribs, his hands, still smoking from the fire, wrapped around my throat. The cold was agonizing. It felt like someone was pouring liquid nitrogen directly into my veins. "Give it to me," he hissed, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled of a 1,000-year-old grave. My vision began to swim. The edges of the garage started to fade into a dark, blurry gray. My hands fumbled blindly among the debris on the floor until they closed around something cold and metallic, a heavy, rusted tow chain. With a final burst of adrenaline, I swung the chain upward, looping it around his neck. I twisted my body, using the momentum to throw him off me. He hit the floor, and I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, pulled the chain tight, and dragged him toward the heavy industrial workbench. I threw the end of the chain over the steel vice grip bolted to the bench and cranked the handle with everything I had. The chain tightened around his throat. He clawed at the metal links, his black fingernails screeching against the iron, but he couldn't break free. He hung there, suspended against the workbench, his legs kicking uselessly. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then the temperature in the garage plummeted even further. My own breath began to freeze in the air, forming a thick mist that obscured everything. Through the mist, I saw his eyes. They weren't milky anymore. They were glowing with a pale, rhythmic blue light. The garage door, the big, heavy rolling door that had been frozen shut by 3 feet of snow, suddenly began to groan. The metal started to buckle inward as if a massive, invisible hand was pushing against it from the outside. Creak, pop, bang. The ice outside wasn't just melting, it was shattering. And through the gaps in the buckling door, I saw hundreds of pairs of those same pale, blue eyes staring in from the blizzard. He wasn't the only one, he was just the first. The garage door didn't just break, it wept. The metal shrieked as it was peeled back like a rusted sardine can, the rivets popping and flying across the room like shrapnel. I stood paralyzed, the heavy tow chain still wrapped around the neck of the first intruder, but he was no longer my primary concern. Outside, the world was no longer a chaotic swirl of white. The blizzard had organized itself. Dozens of silhouettes stood in the waist-deep snow, perfectly still, their forms nearly invisible against the storm except for their eyes. Those pale, rhythmic blue lights pulsed in unison like the steady beat of a frozen heart. The man chained to the workbench stopped struggling. He slumped forward, his charred, blackened face tilting toward the opening in the wall. A low, vibrating hum began to rise from the crowd outside, a sound that bypassed my ears and rattled directly in my teeth. "The circle is closed," the chained man whispered, his voice now a chorus of a dozen overlapping tones. "The fire is just a delay." One of the figures from the snow stepped forward. It was a woman, or at least it had been once. She wore a tattered summer dress that was frozen stiff, standing out like a bell around her skeletal frame. Her skin was the color of a bruised plum, and her hair was a crown of jagged icicles. She didn't walk, she glided over the surface of the drifts, her feet never sinking. She stopped at the threshold of the garage, the blue light in her eyes flaring as she looked at the oil-slicked floor and my battered car. She raised a hand, a delicate, frozen thing, and pointed directly at my chest. "A hot ember," she voiced, and the sound was like the cracking of a frozen lake in a field of ash. I backed away, my heels hitting the rear wall of the garage. I grabbed a flare from the emergency kit on the floor, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the striker. I ignited it, and the garage was suddenly flooded with a harsh, crimson glare. The figures at the door hissed and recoiled from the red light. It wasn't just the heat they hated, it was the color. The red of the flare represented life, blood, and everything they had lost to the ice. "Stay back," I screamed, waving the flare in a wide arc. "I'll burn this whole place down, I'll take all of you with me." The woman in the summer dress tilted her head, a slow, clicking sound coming from her neck. "The wood is wet, the oil is cold, you have one spark, we have the eternity of the north." From the shadows of the driveway, more figures emerged. Old men in flannel shirts, children in winter coats that were now part of their skin, all of them with the same blue-light gaze. They began to crawl over the buckled garage door, their movements synchronized and silent. I looked at the car. The gas tank was nearly full. If I could get to the passenger side, turn the ignition and floor it, I might be able to burst through the back wall of the garage into the yard. It was a desperate, suicidal move, but staying here meant becoming a blue-eyed statue in their macabre collection. I threw the flare toward the oil slick beneath the workbench. The oil was too heavy to ignite instantly, but the heat began to thin it out, sending a plume of black smoke into the rafters. As the creatures diverted their attention to the flame, I dove for the car. I scrambled through the broken passenger window, glass cutting my palms. I didn't care. I reached for the ignition, praying the battery hadn't succumbed to the unnatural cold. Chug, chug, chug. "Come on," I sobbed, slamming my fist against the dashboard. "Come on." Outside the windshield, the woman in the summer dress was pressed against the glass. She wasn't smiling anymore. She placed both hands on the hood of the car, and I watched in horror as the metal began to turn white with frost, the engine block groaning as the oil inside turned to sludge. Chug, vroom. The engine roared to life, a beautiful, screaming sound of internal combustion. I slammed the car into reverse, aiming for the thin wooden wall that separated the garage from the backyard. The engine's roar was a violent intrusion into the frozen silence of the garage. The car vibrated with a desperate energy, the heat from the dashboard beginning to thaw my frozen fingertips. But the woman in the summer dress didn't move. She stood her ground, her palms pressed flat against the hood. I watched in terror as the blue light in her eyes intensified, and the metal of the car began to groan and warp under her touch, as if the engine itself were being crushed by an invisible weight. "Go, go, go!" I screamed at the car, shifting the gear into reverse. I floored the accelerator. The tires spun wildly on the oil-slicked concrete, screaming and sending up a cloud of acrid blue smoke. For a second, the car stayed stationary, locked in a tug-of-war with the frozen woman. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the ice anchoring the tires snapped. The car lunged backward. I wasn't aiming for the driveway, that was a graveyard of snow and monsters. I was aiming for the back wall of the garage, the one made of thin plywood and siding that led to the open backyard. Crash! The rear of the car slammed into the wall. The wood splintered like matchsticks and the entire structure of the garage shuddered. I hit the gas again. The car groaned, pushing through the debris until finally the wall gave way completely. I burst out into the night, the car fishtailing as it hit the deep, untouched snow of the garden. I didn't stop. I shifted into drive and plowed forward, the headlights cutting through the blinding whiteout. I could see the silhouettes of more figures in the periphery, children with frost-covered faces, old men with jagged icicles for teeth, all of them turning their blue-eyed gaze toward the moving heat of my vehicle. I looked in the rearview mirror. The garage was now a glowing red lantern in the dark, the flare I had thrown finally igniting the oil and the wooden rafters. In the silhouette of the flames, I saw the man I had chained to the workbench. He wasn't dead. He had ripped the vice grip right out of the heavy timber, and he was standing in the middle of the fire, the red flames licking at his frozen skin without causing him to flinch. He raised the crowbar and pointed it toward the road. I reached the end of my backyard and slammed through the wooden fence, the car bouncing violently as it hit the main road. The road was a nightmare, untouched by plows, a river of white that threatened to swallow my tires at every turn. I kept the pedal to the floor, the engine screaming in protest. I drove for what felt like miles, my eyes straining to see even a few feet in front of the hood. The heater was on full blast, but the wind rushing through the shattered driver's side window kept the cabin at a lethal temperature. My left side was becoming numb, the skin turning a frightening shade of gray. Suddenly, the engine began to sputter. "No, no, no, not now," I pleaded. I looked at the dashboard. The temperature gauge wasn't rising, it was dropping. The coolant was freezing while the engine was running. The unnatural cold followed the car, a localized storm that was actively trying to kill the machine. The car shivered once, twice, and then the engine died with a final metallic gasp. I coasted for a few yards before the tires sank into a massive drift, bringing me to a dead halt. I sat in the silence, the only sound being the ticking of the cooling metal. I looked out the window. I was in the middle of the woods, miles from the nearest town. Then I saw a flicker of blue in the trees. One by one, the lights appeared. They hadn't chased me. They didn't need to. They were already here, waiting. The silence that followed the engine's death was heavier than the storm itself. The dashboard lights flickered once, twice, and then vanished, leaving me in a tomb of plastic and glass. My breath was now a thick, frozen fog that coated the inside of the windshield. I looked out into the tree line, and the blue lights were no longer just flickering, they were advancing. They moved with a synchronized swaying motion like kelp caught in an underwater current. There were dozens of them, men, women, and things that had been out in the ice for so long they barely looked human anymore. They didn't sink into the 4-foot drifts, they walked on top of the crust of the snow, their weight seemingly non-existent. I reached for the door handle, but it was frozen solid. The car was becoming a pressurized chamber of cold. I looked at my hands, they were a ghostly white, the tips of my fingers already turning a bruised, necrotic purple. "Not like this," I whispered, my voice barely a croak. "I won't let it end like this." I remembered the emergency flare kit. I had one flare left, a high-intensity magnesium road flare. It was tucked under the passenger seat. I lunged for it, my joints screaming with the effort. I found the plastic tube, ripped the cap off, and held the striker ready. Suddenly, a massive asterisk thud shook the car. I looked up. The woman in the tattered summer dress was standing on the roof of the car. Her weight caused the metal to groan and sag inward. She leaned over the edge, her face appearing upside down against the shattered driver's side window. The blue light in her eyes was so bright it illuminated the interior of the car in a sickening, ghostly hue. "The fire is gone," she whispered, her voice vibrating through the glass. "The cycle is complete. Join the quiet." She reached a hand through the broken window. I didn't pull back this time. I waited. As her frozen fingers brushed against the skin of my neck, sending a shock of lethal cold through my spine, I struck the flare. The interior of the car erupted in a blinding, violet-white light. Magnesium burns at over 3,000 degrees. The heat was instantaneous and violent. The woman shrieked, a sound like 1,000 mirrors shattering at once, and recoiled, her frozen flesh sublimating into steam where the light touched her. The heat from the flare was so intense that the frost on the windows turned to water and then to vapor in seconds. I used the flare like a torch, thrusting it out the broken window. The creatures in the road hissed and shielded their eyes, backing away into the tree line. They weren't just afraid of the heat. The magnesium light was like a miniature sun, and it was blinding their ancient, winter-adapted vision. I kicked the driver's side door with both feet. The ice holding it shut snapped, and I tumbled out into the snow, holding the burning flare high above my head. I began to walk. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay by the car. Every step was an agony of frozen muscles, but the flare provided a small, 6-foot circle of life-saving heat. As long as it burned, they couldn't touch me. But magnesium flares only last for 10 minutes. I looked ahead through the swirling snow and saw a structure. It wasn't a house. It was an old, abandoned stone firewatch tower rising out of the trees like a jagged tooth. If I could reach the stone walls, I could build a real fire. I could barricade the door. Behind me, I heard the crunch of snow. The blue-eyed legion was following, staying just outside the circle of the flare's light. They were waiting for the spark to die. They were patient. They had all of eternity, and I had 9 minutes of light left. I reached the base of the tower. The door was heavy iron, rusted but solid. I threw my shoulder against it, and it groaned open on frozen hinges. I ducked inside and slammed the bolt home just as the flare began to sputter. The darkness of the tower was absolute, but I could hear them. They were scratching at the stone walls, thousands of frozen fingernails against rock. 9 minutes, I breathed, fumbling in the dark for anything that would burn. I just need one more spark. The magnesium flare sputtered, throwing erratic, blinding sparks that hissed against the damp stone floor of the tower. I was in a circular room, barely 10 feet wide. Outside, the scratching on the walls had grown into a rhythmic pounding. They weren't just trying to get in, they were trying to vibrate the very stone until it cracked. I scanned the room with the dying light. In the center sat an old iron wood stove, its chimney pipe venting out through the roof. Next to it was a small pile of discarded wooden crates and a stack of old, yellowed forestry logs. 5 minutes of light left. I dived for the crates, smashing them apart with my boots. My hands were so numb they felt like wooden blocks, making it nearly impossible to grip the splintered wood. I shoved the tinder into the belly of the stove. I reached for the flare, intending to use its last moments of heat to ignite the wood, but a sudden, violent crash from above stopped me. The skylight at the very top of the tower shattered. The woman in the summer dress didn't fall. She descended, her frost-covered limbs locking into the stone crevices as she climbed down the interior wall like a lizard. Her blue eyes were twin beacons of cold in the darkness. Behind her, more shapes began to pour through the broken glass, the children, the old men, the silent legion of the ice. "The hearth is cold," she hissed, her voice echoing off the stone. "The sun has forgotten this place." I ignored her and thrust the dying flare into the pile of wood. The magnesium reacted violently with the dry timber, and within seconds, a roar of orange flame erupted. The heat hit my face like a physical hand, and for the first time in hours, I felt the agonizing sting of returning circulation. The creatures shrieked. They huddled against the far wall, their skin steaming and peeling as the radiation from the fire hit them. The tower was small, and the heat from the iron stove was intensifying rapidly. "You can't stay in the fire forever," the woman spat, her form beginning to wither and shrink as the temperature rose. "I don't have to," I gasped, throwing the last of the heavy forestry logs into the stove. "I just have to outlast the storm." I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the side of the stove. I didn't attack them. Instead, I began to bank the fire, making it burn as hot and as fast as possible. The iron stove began to glow a dull, cherry red. The stone room, once a freezer, was now becoming an oven. The creatures couldn't handle it. One by one, they began to liquefy, not into blood, but into clear, sterile water that evaporated before it even hit the floor. The woman was the last to remain. She reached out a hand, her fingers turning into mist as they approached the heat of the stove. "We are the winter," she whispered, her blue eyes fading into a dull gray, "and winter always returns." With a final, silent hiss, she vanished. The blue lights in the room went out, replaced by the warm, flickering gold of the fire. I sat by the stove for hours, feeding it every scrap of wood I could find. Outside, the blizzard continued to howl, but the scratching had stopped. The rhythmic pounding was gone. There was only the wind. When the sun finally rose, the world was buried in a pristine, silent white. I stepped out of the tower into the blinding morning light. My car was a distant white mound in the trees, and my house was likely a scorched ruin, but the air felt different. The unnatural chill was gone. The snow was just snow again. I started walking toward the main road, my breath coming out in normal, soft puffs of steam. I knew that when the next blizzard came, I wouldn't be watching TV on the couch. I'd be watching the windows. Because now I knew what was waiting in the whiteout, and I knew that the only thing keeping them back was the fragile, flickering strength of a single spark.